the Greater Jihād, Sufism as Islamic mysticism. Answer these questions from our last discussion. What are Sunnah, Hadith, Sharia, Fiqh, the pillars of Islam, Shahada, Sunni, and Imam? How did the Hadith collections come about? What do they contain, and what are they trying to do? What do Shiites and Sunnis agree on? What do they disagree on? Part 1. The folk religion problem. Previously, we looked at how the sayings of Muhammad, the Hadith, were compiled together into enormous collections, and thus could be used to establish the Prophet's Sunnah, his precedent, the example he left behind on how to live. The side effect of the Sunnah being recorded like this was the development of fiqh, the human attempt at understanding God's Sharia, the way that God wants people in the world to work. Having many volumes of hadith, seerahs, and the Qur'an at one's fingertips allowed certain people to pursue fiqh systematically, creating schools of fiqh, each of which claimed to explain how one was supposed to practice Islam in any and all possible circumstances. And let's underscore the word practice here. Fiqh was and still is, by and large, about how to behave, ritual, morality, as well as law. But then we have to ask, what was going on in people's heads? Sure, by the time the schools of fiqh started to appear in the 9th century, all Muslims prayed roughly the same way, fasted roughly the same way, and went on Hajj roughly the same way. But what did people think about all this? What did it mean? Although there have been some issues regarding formal theology in Islamic history, these have only really mattered to the elites, caliphs in their courts, scholars, and people with some kind of public religious authority, people who could read, write, and whose religious opinions directly affected many other people. But what about the overwhelming majority of people on the ground? What was classical Islam to the poor, to workers, to slaves, to the uneducated, to women? What did Islam mean to all of these people, the overwhelming majority of the population? Well, the simple answer is, Islam meant whatever a given Muslim said it meant. Unless you had to publicly explain your religious opinions to people for some reason, you were free to believe nearly anything. Now, this is sort of a problem. If you're a historian of religion, most of the data you're going to have to look at comes from the upper rungs of society, the small handful of educated people who are literate or hold some kind of political, social, or economic power. These are the people who create books, and artwork, and laws. These are the people we think of as having religious authority. But that's always going to be a very small minority of a given population, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what the overwhelming majority of people are actually doing and thinking. This is the problem of what religious studies scholars refer to as folk religion, the religion of typical people. If a small number of powerful people claim to have religious authority in some form or another, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're right, or that they're actually speaking on behalf of their own populations. It just means that they're powerful or influential enough to propagate their interpretation of a given religion. We've met this already when we discussed the imperial forms of Christianity. Sure, the bishops and the emperors had official positions about the Trinity, Jesus' role, and the relationship of church and state. But common people might not necessarily agree with them. Or maybe the common people only agree with the official Christianity because the people who have power are the ones who are pushing it. and not actually because they find these arguments convincing or even understand what these people are arguing for. Even today, in our very literate age where you can look everything up, most Christians probably couldn't explain the precise opinions of their given church. And how much more was this true in the past, when you couldn't easily refer to a book or the internet? So just because a certain bishop in the Middle Ages claims one thing, that doesn't mean the cook who works in his kitchen or the laborer in his field necessarily agrees, or even knows what that bishop claims. And besides, just because an imperial church or a famous preacher claims to have authority, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best people to speak on behalf of what all Christians are actually thinking and doing. The problem of folk religion is even more extreme for Islam. Sure, Islam by the 8th and 9th centuries was just as much as an imperial religion as Byzantine Christian orthodoxy. But unlike state Christianity, state Islam is theologically very simple. There's no convoluted government-sponsored creeds about God's relationship to himself or other opinions that everyone was supposed to hold. For Muslims, it was always just about the simple belief that God is one. He sends messages, especially the Qur'an, and he sends messengers, especially Muḥammad. So basically, Islamic belief is just the belief of the Shahada, that there's no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. And that simplicity isn't a coincidence either. Remember that Islam grew up in the shadow of imperial Christianity's vision of orthodoxy. Islam was, in many ways, a protest movement, rejecting the more abstruse aspects of Christian thought, just as much as it was rejecting the Christian emperors who tried to push that thought on people. And so that leaves Muslims a lot of wiggle room about how to interpret the interior dimensions of Islam, what Islam and its various claims and practices means. And that also means that when an outsider looks at Islam, the only detectable patterns the non-Muslim are going to see are issues of practice and morality. This is also why non-Muslims tend to assume that Islam is particularly legalistic. But most Muslims are not caliphs or scholars of fiqh. Part 2. Islamic mysticism. As the collections of hadith and the schools of fiqh started to appear in the 8th and 9th centuries, there was another Islamic development that was happening at the same time: the appearance of Islamic mysticism and asceticism. Like how the imperial Christian theologies appeared simultaneously and a little independently to the appearance of Christian monasticism and saints, the Islam of common people grew and transformed somewhat separately from the academic studies of fiqh and the Sunnah. Most Muslims weren't scholars and had no access to books. But they did have access to the Qur'an, because remember, the Qur'an is an oral recitation. You memorize it and chant it. So even otherwise uneducated people could, if they wanted to, learn some of the Qur'an by heart. So Islamic folk religion often comes straight out of the Qur'an, even though most of the people practicing it, which is most Muslims for most of history, weren't actually reading the Qur'an at all. Let's back up to the origins of Islam for just a minute. In the Qur'an, we're told that only God is God, and all other things are just signs of God. The entirety of the world points to something beyond the world, the unseen reality of God. And because there are signs, ayat, of God everywhere, this shouldn't be news to anyone. We already know the truth, but we've just forgotten it, or ignored it, or misinterpreted it. Therefore, the Quran and the Prophet who brings it are reminders of God. They're telling you how to remember something that you already know at some level. So you don't need new information, you just need to remember. The Arabic word for this is dhikr, a remembrance, a reminder. A dhikr is something you do to remind yourself of God. For example, reciting the Qur'an, or God's 99 names, or the Shahada are acts of dhikr. They help the Muslim remember God and look beyond the mundane, imminent world. So, while the upper crust of the Islamic empires were defining Islam through the Sunnah of the Prophet, which involves lots of reading of hadith and books of fiqh, other Muslims were defining Islam through acts of dhikr, things that someone could say or do to help you remember the truth of God. In other words, they were practicing mysticism. They were trying to experience God in their daily lives. The general word for Islamic mysticism is Sufism. Sufi literally just means a wool wearer, someone who wears the cheap, uncomfortable clothes of the poor. Interestingly, it was probably first a nod to Christian monks, who would often wear itchy wool as an act of penitence. So this word tells us that some early Muslims were actively choosing to live simple lives of remembrance of God, just as the Christian mystics did. But the term Sufi came much later to refer to the whole variety of Islamic mysticisms, the various folk practices of Islam, the many ways common Muslims were trying to remember God beyond the official practices preached by the schools of fiqh. Now, these Sufis were not necessarily at odds with the development of the imperial expressions of Islam, like the schools of fiqh. But rather than just focusing on the ins and outs of Islamic practice, the Sufis were looking for direct, personal experiences of God. For example, the pillars of Islam say that you should testify to the Shahada, say prayer, give alms, fast during Ramadan, and go on the Hajj. But some of the Sufis would take these general practices to radical extremes, in search of the experience and meaning of the practices. They would recite the Shahada, or the names of God, or short sections of the Qur'an over and over again, perhaps thousands of times in a day. Or they would say not only their 5 daily prayers, but they would pray endlessly, or even sing or dance until they passed into states of religious ecstasy. Or they would give away all of their worldly possessions as alms to the poor, and then themselves begin to live as renouncers and wandering beggars. Or they would fast for long periods of time, even when it wasn't Ramadan. Or they would reproduce the rituals of the Hajj, even when they weren't in Mecca. The ordinances of Islam weren't just practices for the Sufi. They were dhikr. They were to be performed so much, or with so much devotion, that it would force the Sufi to remember that God was always hidden beyond the reality of the world. These kinds of Sufi practices were especially popular to common Muslims who had little connection to the upper tiers of society, to the poor, women, and the marginalized. So for a famous example of this early Sufism, we can look at Rābi'a al Adawiyya. Rābi'a was an Iraqi woman from Basra, and she was a slave who became famous for her wisdom and mystical practices. Now, she lived right at the same time as when the imperial forms of Islam were turning to the Sunnah of the Prophet as the linchpin for fiqh and orthodoxy. At this time, Muslims were just starting to argue that to be a good Muslim was to be particularly invested in what Muhammad said and did. A legend about Rābi'a tells us about someone who asked her about this very topic. Rābi'a was asked, "How is your love for the Prophet? May God bless and preserve him." To which she replied, "Surely I love him, but love for the Creator has turned me away from love for created things." So, does she love Muhammad? Yes, of course she does. But she doesn't fix on him either, because the only thing she really loves is God himself. and Muhammad is not God. For the Sufis, there was a certain danger in practicing Islam for its own sake. Islam is not God. It's a way that God reveals himself. One has to look through the tenets of Islam to the ultimate reality that they refer to. One shouldn't follow Muhammad's sunnah because of Muhammad, but because it's an expression of God. And one shouldn't worship God because they long for his blessings or fear his power, but because God is worthy of love. In another story, Rābi'a was wandering around in the middle of the daytime carrying a torch and a bucket of water. When asked why she was doing this, why she was walking around with a torch while the sun was up, she replied, "I carry a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. With these things I'm going to set fire to paradise and put out the flames of hellfire, so that voyagers to God can rip the veils and see the real goal." If someone worships God just because they want to go to paradise, well then, they don't worship God. They don't love God, they just love themselves. They just want to be rewarded and happy. That isn't devotion, that's selfishness. And if someone worships God just because they fear damnation, well that's not love either. That's just fearing pain. Paradise and hell aren't God. Instead, they're like veils, blocking the Muslim from understanding the truth. They're just signs, and so you need to look beyond them. Back to the Qur'an again. In the Qur'an, the ultimate sin is shirk, association of something created with God, the Creator. Nothing in the whole world is God. God is one, unique, and beyond everything we see and know about. So, worshipping anything other than God is shirk, because other gods aren't the real God. But it isn't just about polytheism, because no thing is God. So, denying charity is shirk, because it's attributing ultimate value to money, treating money like it's your God. Being obsessed with drinking or eating or sexuality is shirk, because you're treating your alcohol, food, and your body as gods when they're not. And so for Sufis, there is one false idol that is particularly problematic. You. You treat yourself as God. You love yourself. You make sacrifices to yourself. You give yourself offerings of food and honor and money and sex. But you aren't God. You are not what is ultimately real or true or worthy of love. Therefore, if you truly love God, you have to smash the idol that is yourself. The Sufis call this fana, which means annihilation or extinction. Fana is the blotting out of yourself, the most dangerous false idol. Fana is learning that you're not really real. You're not God. As a popular hadith of Muhammad recounts, you have to die before you die. You're your own worst enemy, and you have to defeat this enemy before you stand before God on Judgment Day. Often, Sufis will even frame this predicament as a kind of combat with yourself. In another famous hadith that appeared around the 11th century, Muhammad is speaking to some of his companions after a battle. When they got back to Medina, the Prophet is reported to have said, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad." When asked, "What is the greater jihad?" Muhammad replied, "It is the jihad against oneself." Part 3. Sufism drunk and sober. In one sense, Sufism can be understood as the most intense expression of Islam. These were people of supreme devotion to God, so they would perform radical acts of love and piety. And many Sufis came to be considered as saints, holy people who had experienced God firsthand and could speak with authority about unseen reality. They were people who moved beyond their own human limitations and came to mystical insight. They had conquered themselves and made contact with mystery. And not surprisingly, Sufism proliferated the Islamic world as it still does. Wherever there are Muslims, whether Sunni or Shiite, from Pakistan to Sudan to New York, there are Muslims practicing various kinds of Sufism, along with their given schools of fiqh. But in another sense, many Muslims saw Sufism as a kind of religious innovation. They're just making things up and practicing strange interpretations of Islam. Random people with little or no training in the Sunnah of the Prophet or the schools of fiqh, doing and saying bizarre things. To this day, many Muslims have a deep distrust of Sufism, just as many others see it as the most perfect form of Islam. Here's a famous story from a Sufi named al-Bistami. He was a famous Sufi, and he lived his life as a radical renouncer of worldly luxuries. Legends about him report that once he cried out in ecstasy, "Glory be to me, how great is my majesty." This is a riff on a famous Quranic phrase, "Glory be to God." So it seems that Bistami was claiming to be God himself. And naturally, many Muslims understood this as utter blasphemy. This crazy man was claiming to be God. Not only was this Sufi not a saint, he was at least insane, if not a heretic. But if you look at what he's saying through the eyes of Sufism, he isn't claiming to be God at all. Bistami is claiming to have undergone fina. His self has been completely destroyed. He died before he died. So when Bistami looked at himself, what he saw was that his self wasn't real. Only God was real. Therefore, when he reflected on himself and everything else, the only thing that truly exists there is God. This Bistami was just a false idol. This is an extreme example of Sufism, but it tells us quite a bit. If you read it at face value, Sufism can often seem outright scandalous to many Muslims. But at the same time, Sufism can also be functioning as a kind of Islamic performance art. Bistami is publicly doing something sensational to remind people of the Quranic teaching to remember God alone and to overcome false idols, most especially the false idol of yourself. And so we can also interpret him here ironically. Imagine seeing someone say that they're God, and they say this in public. You'd probably laugh it off. Of course that strange guy isn't God. It's so obvious. But then you think for a second. If it's so obvious that that guy isn't God, shouldn't it be just as obvious that you're not God either? But you walk around talking about yourself as if you're God all the time, even if you don't say that directly. Well, maybe you're just as crazy and wrong as he is. Those forms of Sufism that were known for these kind of over-the-top displays and utterances of divine madness and strange practices came to be referred to as drunken Sufism, the Sufism of madness, passion, and ecstatic experiences. This is the mysticism of Sufis who are intoxicated by God. So they're like literal drunk people. They tend to say, do, and think things that are a little bit off the wall. Drunken Sufism makes for a great spectacle. It's hard to ignore a guy who calls himself God, or a slave woman wandering around in the daytime with a torch and a bucket of water, looking to destroy paradise and hell. But these kinds of things are also bound to be misunderstood by most people. I mean, they are a little strange. Counterbalancing the sensationalism of the drunken Sufis, there's also the much wider and more subtle expression of sober Sufism. Intense devotional practices, dhikr, minus all the wacky stuff. Around the 12th and 13th centuries, Sufis started to practice more controlled, systematic forms of mysticism. These took the form of tariqas, Sufi fraternities or brotherhoods, literally Sufi paths. These were schools of Sufism, where people weren't just saying and doing whatever they pleased. Instead, the would-be Sufi was guided by a more advanced mystic who had traveled the path before and knew the way. These were the sheikhs, or for women, sheikhas, spiritual masters, teachers of the Islamic mystical traditions. A student left to their own devices might get confused or led astray by false beliefs or misinterpreting religious practices. But the sheikh can guide them, encouraging the student who feels that a certain practice maybe isn't working, or correcting errors or misunderstandings, and offering suggestions on new practices or meditations the student could try. There are many of these tariqas, these Sufi brotherhoods, all around the world to this day, and they each have their own sheikhs, histories, and forms of dhikr. All of them, and there are hundreds, insist that the Sufi follow all of the outward practices of Islam, the 5 pillars and all the other ordinances of one school of fiqh. But they add on top of those extra practices designed to bring one into contact with God somehow or another. A couple of examples. The Qadariyya order, originally from Persia and quite common today in the Arab world, South Asia, and China, will simply repeat the names of God over and over and over again, either loudly in groups or silently to oneself. The Qadariyya will regulate their breathing and strain to remember God all of the time. So if you devote every work and every word and every breath to God, then in time, God will be the only thing you think about. Then you'll remember. There's also the famous Mevlevi order, founded in Turkey and now spread elsewhere. Their founder, Jalaluddin Rumi, who lived in the 13th century, is presently the best-selling poet in the world, including in the United States. His students, the Mevlevis, are the people known in English as the whirling dervishes. Their dhikr is a kind of ritualized dance, in which the sheikh instructs the students to spin slowly around on one foot, while also revolving around in a circle. With accompanying music and poetry, the Mevlevi ideally enters a mystical state of contemplation, in which they'll come to understand that it's actually the unseen God that they and everything else are truly orbiting. There are many, many other Sufi tariqas, both national and international, and each has its own forms of dhikr and its own line of sheikhs. Often, people will be members of more than one Sufi brotherhood, or they'll enter one as part of their professional guild. And sometimes people travel far and wide to be able to study under the guidance of a particularly gifted sheikh. And Sufism is hardly a marginal phenomenon either. There are Sufis everywhere that there's Islam. In the subcontinent in Indonesia, Sufis number in the tens, if not hundreds of millions. There are massive numbers of Sufis in the Arab world and China, too. In Chad, Niger, Cameroon, Ghana, and Liberia, more than a quarter of all Muslims also identify with at least one of the Sufi tariqas. In Turkey, more than half of Muslims are Sufis. And in Senegal, Sufism is followed by a whopping 90% of the Muslim population. In fact, the power and influence of the Sufis has even been considered a threat by many of the more oppressive Islamic regimes. Sufism has occasionally been outlawed, or at least suppressed, as a deviant expression of Islam sometimes. And conversely, The US government has actively tried to promote Sufism around the world as a means of combating violent movements. While Sufism has often been considered a kind of corruption in the Ummah within many Islamic circles, elsewhere, the Sufis are the vanguard of Islam itself. The spread of Islam in India and Indonesia was more due to popular Sufi sheikhs than any Islamic government. And in North America today, converts are much more likely to get drawn to Islam from Sufi practice than by the schools of fiqh. Some questions for class discussion. What is Sufism and how did it develop? Define dhikr, the Greater Jihād, fana, drunken Sufism, tariqas, and sheikhs. What are some of the ways Sufism has manifested itself over Islamic history?